Okay, now that we have gone over the concepts of membrane potential and equilibrium potential, we're now able to address this concept of resting membrane potential. Okay, so in this part of the lecture, we are going to be addressing these questions. What factors determine a cell's resting membrane potential? What is the role of permeability in determining resting membrane potential? And what is the role of the sodium-potassium ATPase in establishing the resting membrane potential? Okay, so looking at this table from the previous video, I want to remind you we have several ions that we see pretty commonly around the cell, and they all have different equilibrium potentials. So each ion is going to try, if it can, to move in such a way as to bring the cell towards its equilibrium potential, right? So potassium basically wants the membrane potential to be at negative 90 millivolts. Sodium wants the membrane potential to be at positive 60 millivolts. And by wants, I mean it's happiest, it's going to be at equilibrium at that value for membrane potential, and so on. And all of these numbers are very different from each other. So every ion is going to try to move in a different way. It has, we have conflicts of interest here, okay? But we only have one membrane potential. So how do we determine what the membrane potential is, given that we have all these different equilibrium potentials for all these different ions? Which ion gets to basically win the competition, right? So is membrane potential going to be closer to the potassium membrane potential? Is it going to be closer to positive 60 millivolts? What's it going to be? Well, it turns out that the membrane potential is going to depend not only on these numbers here, which serve as a driving force for moving those ions, but it's also going to depend on the permeability of the membrane to those ions. So do those ions actually have a path through which they can move? Okay, the next few slides illustrate this concept. So let's start by looking at this example here. We're going to be focusing on sodium ion, which is these orange positively charged ions shown in the diagram. I want to remind you that, since this is the exact same picture that I used before, that we have a membrane potential of 0. I also want to remind you that the sodium equilibrium potential is positive 60 millivolts, which means that sodium then wants the membrane to be at positive 60 millivolts. It's going to be at equilibrium when the membrane is at positive 60 millivolts. Our membrane here is not going to have any channels, so we don't have any channels here. If we take a look at this situation, let's consider this question here, or these two questions. Which way is sodium going to move in this example? And what effect is that going to have on the membrane potential? So please take a moment, hit pause, think about it, answer this question, go. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you figured out that sodium is not going to move at all, right? Because there's no channels for sodium. If it could move, it would move in such a way as to make the membrane more positive, right? So we have a 0 millivolt situation here. Sodium wants to move towards equilibrium, and to do so, it would have to move into the cell to make the inside of the cell more positive than the outside of the cell. However, it doesn't have the opportunity to do that because we don't have any sodium channels in the membrane. Therefore, we're not going to have any movement of sodium, and the membrane potential is going to stay at 0 millivolts. Next up, let's consider this situation right here. Again, this is a figure that you saw from the previous video. I am using these same figures a lot. But remember that in this situation, we had the potassium ion move out of the cell, just one potassium ion. So let's just kind of pretend that as a result, the inside of the cell is maybe 10 or 20 millivolts more negative than the outside of the cell. Okay, so let's just kind of consider this diagram to represent a negative 10 or negative 20 millivolt membrane potential. I want to remind you that potassium ion, first of all, that we're using these purple diamonds to indicate potassium. Okay. I want to remind you that potassium equilibrium potential is negative 90 millivolts. And I want you to consider the same question, right? So we have this different situation, but in this setting, which way is potassium going to move? How is that going to affect membrane potential? So go ahead and pause and answer that question. Okay, so this situation is a little different because we have a channel for potassium here. So we're starting with a situation in which the membrane potential is negative 10 millivolts. Potassium wants the membrane potential to be at negative 90 millivolts. I know I'm sort of using a shortcut in my language here. Really, potassium is going to move towards equilibrium, and in order to be at equilibrium, membrane potential would have to be at negative 90 millivolts. So in order to get closer to equilibrium, potassium is going to move out of the cell so that it can make the inside of the cell even more negative than negative 10 millivolts. It's going to move, it wants the cell to be at negative 90 millivolts, so it's going to move out of the cell to make that membrane potential come down. Okay, so this situation illustrates a situation in which we do have a path through which our ion can move. So when we have that driving force, which is the equilibrium potential, and a path, which is the channel, potassium can then move towards its equilibrium potential, okay? And I already explained this, that the ion is going to move in a direction that brings it closer to its equilibrium potential. So in this case, sodium moved out so that we can bring the membrane potential down closer to the sodium equilibrium. Sorry, did I say sodium? Potassium moved out so that we can bring the membrane potential down closer to the potassium equilibrium potential, okay? So this basically illustrates this concept right here. The more permeable the membrane is to a particular ion, the closer the membrane potential will be to that ion's equilibrium potential, right? So any ion, every ion is going to want to move towards equilibrium. But no matter how badly that ion wants to move towards equilibrium, its ability to move is going to be governed by the presence or absence of channels in the membrane. If an ion is able to move closer to its equilibrium, then that's going to cause the membrane potential to be closer to that ion's equilibrium potential.